It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Fellow Quillers, I am so pleased to welcome our guest for this episode. Her research into the origins of English literature, poetry, and works of drama will astound you. She is Jessica Winston, professor of English at Idaho State University. Her very awesome specialty is 16th century literature. Her famous book is Lawyers at Play, Literature, Law, and Politics at the Early Modern Inns of Court, 1558 through 1581. It is a magnificent study on how the Inns of Court shaped English literature in profound ways. She is Jessica Winston. Jessica, we are so honored to welcome you to the Quiller Nation.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Your book is outright fascinating. The amount of English literary history you reveal there is so enlightening into the world that sort of engendered the development of English literature as we know it. And I have so much that I want to talk to you about.
I'm excited to talk about the book. It took a long time to write it, and it was, in the end, a labor of love as well as passion. And so I'm glad that you enjoyed it.
Well, I know a lot of listeners out there are going to want to go find a copy, which isn't necessarily the easiest thing to do. So, folks, I want to tell you how to do that. It is from Oxford University Press. It is Jessica Winston. She has two S's, and Winston is spelled as it sounds, Winston. Lawyers at Play. It is available in hardback and in paperback. I have a paperback copy right here in my hot little hands, and I have been tremendously enjoying this book. I'd like to dive right into it right from the start. You open chapter 1 with a quote from 2 Henry 4 from Shakespeare to illustrate some details and the importance of knowing how the society of the Inns of Court actually worked. And I think it's important, if you could share some of those details, I think it's important for listeners to understand what type of world we're dealing with when we're talking about the Inns of Court, their importance to the shaping and the molding of not just what we're going to get into about the literature, but the politics and society and even just men of the time knowing how to be men of court or men of the law. Could you share some of that with us? Because I think that's so important as the foundation of the conversation.
Sure. So maybe I could start by talking about some of the background about what the Inns of Court are and kind of how they worked in English society. And then as I talk, you can just kind of prompt me as you want more information or to
Sure.
go in specific directions. So the Inns of Court can be easily described, or at least in the first instance described, as the law schools in Renaissance England. So they were the places that young men would go to in order to study the law, specifically the common law, and they could obtain the credentials to become barristers at law and ultimately kind of plead cases in the central courts at Westminster, like the Court of the King's Bench and the Court of Common Pleas. So their name is a little obscure, the Inns of Court, and the origins of the inns are obscure. There have been a variety of explanations as to how the inns originated. One thought is that when lawyers and judges came to London during term time, they needed places to stay. This is in the medieval period, and so they stayed at these inns, and then they went to court. So they were the Inns of Court. Another idea is that they originated as residential law schools, and because they were residential, they were inns, and because they were associated with the court, the Inns of Court. Their history goes back to about the mid 14th century. And so we have records going back to about 1388 for the Inns of Court. But by the early modern period, they were kind of well established as law schools. So in the first instance, we can describe them as law schools, kind of centrally located just west of the city of London. At the same time, they had a kind of more complex social function. So only about 15% of the men who came to the Inns of Court actually kind of graduated in the sense of becoming
a bunch of
going through the
dropouts. Is that they're just loaded with a bunch of dropouts then?
That's right. Yeah, something like that. And they did develop, especially by the later 16th century, something of a reputation. But for a long time, going back to the medieval period and into the 16th century, young men often sons of the nobility, but increasingly sons of the gentry, merchants, yeomen, would come to the Inns of Court, not just to gain a legal credential, you might say, but also to get a kind of urban sophistication, learn a little bit of the law that might help them to go back and manage an estate in one of the regions, or to serve as a kind of like local administrator, and basically to have a kind of legal knowledge to just facilitate their functioning as a kind of manager or administrator of their estate.
Well, that makes total sense considering
yeah.
what they would be expected to do if they were, say an earl or a duke, or even just the son of a wealthy merchant or magnate who had developed a certain amount of land holdings or whatever. I mean, there's a lot of regional administration necessary in that day and age. It wasn't necessarily a local judge for somebody to determine decisions of property or ownership or that type of thing. So that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, and something else is that many of these men, especially coming in the ones I study from the 1560s and 70s, were coming to the Inns of Court, again, not necessarily to get a law degree, but they had gone through the grammar schools, some of them had gone through the universities, and they had kind of imbibed this idea that in order to use the purpose of their education was ultimately to serve the state and to serve kind of their nation. And so they were coming to the Inns of Court to get that kind of legal knowledge, but they went on in other types of careers. So for instance, two of the writers I talk about in the 1560s, Barnaby Googe and George Turberville, became kind of sub-ambassadors to Moscow and to Spain. And so they were in a kind of world where some kind of legal knowledge was useful in terms of engaging with other realms of politics, both within England and also
I
beyond.
definitely want to get to that because I think that that's very intriguing and sort of an interesting aspect of how this all develops. But before we dive into like those guys and how they used their membership in these societies to sort of advance their political careers, I want to sort of clarify. So the Inns of Court, and I've been to Middle Temple a couple of times, and it is a very residential complex. I mean, there's like apartments and people live there. So I could understand where that original sort of foundation of these were places for people of the law to stay. Still makes sense to me because there's a lot of people living right there on that. I don't know if you call it a campus or a compound. It feels like a compound. Whenever I've been there, I felt like, wow, I'm surrounded by like armed guard type of a thing. But it is still very much a place where people live and spend their evenings, type of a thing. So I found that very interesting. But at the time, so, 1550s, 1560s and moving forward, these are mostly composed of young nobles, aristocrats, and to some degree, the sons of the high gentry.
For the most part.
Is this sort of like the original frat boy clubs of their time? Is that sort of what we're sort of seeing here with this then?
I mean, there was, I guess you could say there was a frat boy element in the sense that there was, you know, there was study, but there was also a lot of entertainments and activities on the side. So some of those were kind of the communal activities of the group, like eating together in the hall, and some of those were more sort of um, activities of, young men in particular. So drinking, prostitution, gaming with dice. There's records of the men, going to the bear baiting rings in, just south of the Thames, and also going to the theaters. So they were also places for sort of roustabout behavior in addition to study. Yeah.
Were there rivalries between the different inns, or was there sort of like an unspoken code or respect for fellow innsmen no matter which inn they derived from?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and it's somewhat up for debate. So there's four Inns of Court. They are the honorable societies of the Middle and Inner Temple, Gray's Inn, and Lincoln's Inn. And the four of them tend to be, they have slightly different reputations, you might say, that change over time. And so they are different places, but they're a bit like maybe the Oxford and Cambridge colleges, in the sense that while each one individually has a different reputation, together they kind of make up a whole that is sort of seen in one way. So within the Inns of Court, there are sometimes clusters of friends that emerge, and activities that emerge at particular times around particular Inns of Court. So around Gray's Inn in the 1560s, around the Middle Temple in the 1590s. But for the most part, they tend to sort of view themselves fairly equally. And in fact, at some point, they kind of make an agreement that they'll sort of that none of them will ever claim that they're better than the other. So, um, so in that sense, there might be some internal sort of informal dynamics that around, which one is better for what reason, but sort of more publicly facing, they are equal to each other.
Do we find like, and you don't really address this in your book, but I'm just curious about your research. Do you find that there's sort of like a heritage factor, like, my father went to Gray's Inn, so I'm going to Gray's Inn, like my father before me type of thing, where you have certain families, members of certain houses, which occurs in, English prep schools even to this day, right? Like one family is assigned a house, and however many children or ancestors or offspring come through that school, that's that house for that family forever type of a thing. Is there some of that, or did they sort of bounce around at all?
There is some of that. So Wilfred Prest has a big history of the Inns of Court. And one of the things that in the Tudor and Stuart periods, and one of the things that he documents is that there are kind of geographical associations. So like Barnaby Googe was from Kent, and he went to Staple Inn, which was associated with Gray's Inn, and then Gray's Inn. And so there are kind of geographical associations and family associations that draw particular people to particular Inns of Court. So Sir Nicholas Bacon, keeper of the Great Seal, went to Gray's Inn, and then his son, Francis Bacon, also went to Gray's Inn, for instance.
Okay, and you mentioned Googe, and I know that's probably a name a lot of listeners aren't quite familiar with, but he is a very prominent figure in all of this, isn't he? Barnaby Googe.
Yeah, he's a I mean, I like talking about some of these authors from the 1560s, because they were authors that were so well known in their time, but that have, that just don't get much airtime, sort of even in terms of the undergraduate and even the graduate curricula in English, because there's just so much attention that has to necessarily be paid to these major writers of the 1590s, and then kind of into the Jacobean period. So Barnaby Googe was an important writer from the middle of the 16th century. He wrote a variety of poetry, translations, and so he has a great name also. So
Well, he was sort of overshadowed by his cousin William Cecil, though, wasn't he? Because he is a kinsman.
well,
He is a kinsman of the Cecil family, isn't he?
he is a kinsman of the Cecil family, and it seems like he may have gotten some assistance in coming to the inns from Cecil himself. At the same time, he is, um, you know, he is much more literary in his orientation and in his publications than Cecil was.
Certainly. So I was very intrigued to read about the percentages of plotters, revelers, and ancients that were present at each inn, as well as how many writers and translators developed from within the inns. But because I know the audience is going, wait a minute, plotters, revelers, and ancients, what are those? Can we talk a little bit about like how that's defined and how those nicknames sort of came about from within the inns of court?
Yeah, so the Inns of Court are sometimes referred to as the third university of England. So in that sense, this kind of third school. But as I mentioned, they had a complex sort of social function. And so they're also often referred to by contemporary scholars as something like finishing schools, where young men don't just come to learn the law, but to learn some dancing, some ability in oration, some background in the law, and to acquire a kind of urban sophistication. So what that means in practice is that there can be seen to be two groups at the Inns of Court. So the kind of plotters, the law students, and the revelers, who are those men who are coming to the inns, not necessarily to really become a lawyer, but to get this kind of finishing school aspect of the inns. So that term the term plotters and revelers can be tied to Francis Beaumont, the playwright in the early 17th century playwright who was a member of the Inns of Court, who describes them as who describes the inns as having these kind of plotters and these revelers. And then the ancients are those men of the inns who have gone up through the ranks, who are barristers and have even gone beyond that and are now part of the educational system where they're giving readings and things like that. So they're part of the oversight of the inns. So one question is that about the Inns of Court and about the social dynamics of the Inns of Court has to do with the relationship between these kind of plotters and these revelers. So there really did seem to be some students who went to the inns who were more plotters. So Sir Edward Coke, the famous lawyer.
Oh, yeah, wow. I mean, he's probably like one of the most famous English lawyers of the entire period, right? I mean,
yeah. Sir Simon Dews, also a well-known lawyer of the period. These are men who went to the Inns of Court, studied the law, became lawyers, moved up in the ranks, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe more plodding types. At the same time, there are men who went to the Inns of Court who seem to have very little interest in the law. So an example of this would be the poet Thomas Lodge, who was there in the 1590s. And he was sent expressly by his family to learn the law. His mother kind of writes in her will, like he can get this money as long as he actually studies the law. But Lodge had no interest in studying the law, and he complains about how boring it is, and what he really wants to do is just kind of, enjoy the life of the Inns of Court.
he's the party boy.
Yeah, he's more of the party boy.
Yeah.
So there are definitely kind of these distinctions between plotters and revelers. At the same time, there were men who kind of moved back and forth between these groups, and it would be hard to identify them with one or the other. So an example there would be someone like John Davy. Well, we would say it Davies, but I think it's actually pronounced Davis. Davies,
Mhm.
and he wrote some epigrams in the 1590s. He was a member of the Middle Temple. He clearly really wanted to be a lawyer. He was also involved in the revels, and he actually cudgeled another man, Richard Martin, in the Middle Temple Hall because Richard Martin and some friends were constantly criticizing Davies, particularly for how he looked. And he evidently had a rather large ass. So, yeah.
He was a
And so
bubble
he
butt.
walked.
So they pick on him for being a bubble butt, and he says, I got your bubble butt right here. Bang. And he hits one of his fellow Innsmen in the middle of the hall, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right, with this kind of giant stick. And so he's actually expelled from the Middle Temple and then works for several years to try to kind of get back in the good graces of the Middle Temple and to kind of show his penance for his misdeeds. And he eventually kind of becomes a lawyer again. So for him, being a lawyer was really important, but he also was involved in the kind of revels, activities of these kind of these some more finishing school activities,
what would you say
writing
was
of poetry,
the
things like that.
what do you think, what do you say was like the average age of these members while they were there? I mean, I think to some degree, I think we're sort of jaded by modern context as far as like how old a university student is, and weren't they, a lot of them, much younger than we might expect, because they would graduate from university at like 15, 16 years old and then come into the Inns of Court and be basically what we would consider today still teenagers, some of them. Yes.
Yeah, so a lot of them were starting at the Inns of Court at the age of 15 or 16. So one of the writers I write about in the 1560s, Alexander Neville, started at the inns at the age of 16. So yeah, many of them were quite young, but they were often also at the inns for many years. So it would take about 10 years of training to become 7 to 10 years to become a barrister. So they were in residence at the inns, maybe from the age of 16 to 25.
And everything in between.
Yeah, and everything in between.
So
That's right.
putting, hundreds of wealthy, entitled man boys, ages 15 to 22, all together in a group, that's not asking for any kind of trouble or issue, is it?
Yeah, no, none at all, none at all. There's a great story in there was an early 17th century mass called Ulysses and Circe, and the hall got so crowded that the men started climbing up the chimney so that they could get a better view. And, that shows something about how crowded the halls were. But also, these were young men. They were athletic, right? They could climb a chimney, lots of them, and enough of them to actually pull the chimney down.
Well, I recently did an episode about the Comedy of Errors and its presence in a night of revels during a holiday, a Christmas revel season, and how it became known as the Night of Errors because of how packed and unruly the evening became before it was all said and done. So I think it's important that people sort of visualize in their head, yeah, we're talking about, average age 19, 20, and then everything between in that bell curve of 15 to 25 are the plotters and revelers. The ancients, they probably skipped out on some of these crazy scenarios because older men were like, nope, don't need to be a part of that. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I think one thing to keep in mind also related to that in terms of the potential unruliness of the Inns of Court is that they expanded in size quite a bit from after about the 1580s. So one of the things I talk about in Lawyers at Play just has to do with the rise in litigation over the course of the 16th century. So starting in about the 1550s, there's this kind of massive rise in litigation, but it takes a long time, about 30 years, for the Inns of Court to adapt and start admitting more students so that they can meet the needs of this society, this kind of societal need. But after about the 1580s, the Inns of Court are, kind of doubling in their population. And so one aspect of that is just that it's kind of crowded, and there's a lot of building, sometimes kind of illicit building to deal with the crowding. But another is that when you have a smaller group, it's a little bit easier to police the behavior of members just by kind of a snide look and like the evil eye sort of thing. Whereas as it gets larger, the questions of like how you police members' behavior just simply through sort of social expectation become more complex, and basically you can't. And so even within the inns, there's more litigation, you might say, more kind of proceedings around the misbehavior of the members as the inns expand.
That's ironic because, here we are in modern day where there are more lawyers than we need. There are too many lawyers in the world, and lawyers coming out of law school now, there's so many that they're finding difficulty finding jobs, even though we have a very litigious society, probably more litigious than it was then. But it's just kind of funny to think about that. Well, there's too many lawsuits and not enough lawyers to go around being a problem in any place, anywhere, at any time in history. But that was the case, wasn't it?
Yeah, and it's a little hard also to wrap our head around, because on the one hand, there were not enough lawyers. On the other hand, at least by the 1590s, there, with the kind of rebels in Henry VI, the kind of kill all the lawyers, there was a perception that there were too many lawyers. And so what you can see there is that the profession is kind of dramatically expanding, and it's expanding rapidly to fill a need that it's not yet filled. But like with public perception, the public perception is, my gosh, there's litigation all around. There's these lawyers everywhere. It seems like, everywhere I walk in London, there's another kind of law student I'm tripping over. And so there's, on the one hand, the fact that there is not enough, but the public perception is that there's too many. And
is that because there were so many laws and regulations and restrictions that were sort of, impeding upon people's lives, and they blamed the lawyers for that? It's sort of how I think that the whole Henry VI scenario is spelled out there, is that the commoners think, well, the lawyers are doing evil with their pens and upon parchment and creating all of these rules and regulations and laws that we don't understand and can't even read, but yet are dictating how our lives are supposed to be lived.
Yeah. And, the other way to see it is that, so legal historians, mainly this legal historian, Christopher Brooks, has come up with this idea, the sort of curvilinear thesis, which has a kind of, um, it's an abstract term, but the idea is that at periods of major social change, litigation increases in order to kind of work out new societal relations. And so what he says about the latter half of the 16th century is actually there was kind of more litigation per capita in England in the later 16th century than at any time up until about the mid 20th century in England. And so there really was this kind of explosion of litigation and this need for lawyers. But in some sense, the lawyers get blamed rather than the fact of social change and the need to kind of work out, how exactly are we managing our land or transferring these titles or, managing our wills and things like that.
Well, it is such a fascinating time in history. And, and talking about the major change, of course, the first major change that occurs is in 1558, when suddenly there's a new monarch, this young woman queen, and some hope that there will be some stability now after several years of horrible turmoil. And these advisors to her, who are as could be called the ancients of court at that point, right? Who are sort of controlling the government because she is such a young queen and is sort of in over her head to start with, because she never expected that this was going to happen for her. And it does lead to one of the most fascinating periods in history. And I think that that's what ties this together for me, is that, I'm learning through your work how important the Inns of Court were to how this all played out and developed over her 45-year reign. you reference in your book that there's a determination of about the number of courtier poets that were noted throughout Elizabeth's entire reign of some 45 years is around 32 noted courtier poets, give or take, depending upon that classification, whether you include like Spencer or others. But then you point out something really important, which is that there was practically an equal amount of writers associated with the Inns of Court, all in the single decade of the 1560s. That's astounding when you think about, okay, in 1/4 of the time, the Inns of Court produced noteworthy literati, let's call them, equal to the entire period that was produced through, say, the nobility or the courtiers or the privy council who dabbled in writing or creating literature or translations.
Yeah, and one of the questions then so there's a couple of things to say about that. I mean, one of the questions then becomes why? The Inns of Court were around a long time before the 1560s. What was going on to prompt the emergence of this literary kind of circle, community, network in the 1560s? And then you can ask the same question again and again about the 1590s, about the 1610s, about the 1630s. There's kind of these moments where these networks of writers kind of come together and start producing a lot of work in and around the Inns of Court. So there's that question. But one of the questions I had to deal with as I was working on my book and as I've written other articles on the Inns of Court is kind of what constitutes an Inns of Court writer. Because on the one hand, there are writers who are clearly members of the Inns of Court, people like Barnaby Googe, whom I've mentioned, or Thomas Lodge, who are writing while they are members of the Inns of Court. They're publishing, often signing their prefaces with the inn that they are a member of, and sometimes dedicating their works to fellow members of the Inns of Court by name or as a group. So some people are definitely Inns of Court writers. Other authors, there's a question, do they count as an Inns of Court writer or not? So an example would be somebody like Ben Jonson, who was not a member of the Inns of Court, but who clearly was connected with these circles. For instance, he dedicates Every Man Out of His Humor to the gentlemen of the four Inns of Court, although he does say, I understand you gentlemen, not your houses, which I take to mean kind of he understands the milieu and the environment and the people there, but he doesn't really understand how the Inns of Court as institutions work. So is he an Inns of Court writer or is he not? There are questions around.
Well, let me ask you, how do you feel? Would you include him as one or no?
Well, it depends. So I think it depends on the question you're asking. So, for instance, for the 1560s, when I was thinking about what was going on there, I only included writers who were definitely members of the Inns of Court. And the reason for that was that I wanted to really link the writing to the rise in the legal profession and what was going on with the legal profession at the time, and kind of why members of the Inns in particular would have wanted to write poetry or create classical translations.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, I didn't include the poet Isabella Whitney from the 1560s, who's a great poet and interesting also because she's a woman. And she writes miscellaneous poetry that is based on the works of Hugh Platt, his Flowers of Philosophy. So she kind of rewrites those and adapts them. And so she's clearly within the milieu of the Inns of Court. She also she writes a poem called her Will and Testament, where she kind of leaves her writings to members of the Inns of Court. So she's clearly part of this milieu, but I didn't count her as an Inns of Court writer. So because of the
as a woman,
she could never
be a member, right? I mean,
yeah, even though she was part
men's
of that
club.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So I think it depends on the question that I'm that I'm asking kind of whether it's important, how important your relationship is, your official relationship to the inns is. So for somebody like Ben Jonson, I haven't talked about him specifically as an Inns of Court writer, but I have talked about him as someone whose works we can look at to get a sense of how the inns were viewed, both by people who were closely connected with the inns or as reflecting broader public sentiments about the Inns of Court or about lawyers.
Well, I think the greatest takeaway that I have from your book is that after the 1560s, every writer is influenced in some way by the Inns of Court writers, that they shaped and molded literature to such a degree that it's becomes very hard to separate anything that comes afterward, especially because a lot of what comes afterward is then based on translations that were provided by members of the Inns of Court prior. You know what I mean? So I feel like they laid the cornerstones of English literature for their time, and everyone else kind of built upon that moving forward over the next 75, 80 years, maybe on until today.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and it's a great way to say that, which is that so much literary innovation happens in and around the Inns of Court in particular. So, the rise in the interest in Ovidian and Apilia. So Shakespeare's The Rape of Lucrece and Venus and Adonis are counted as Ovidian and Apilia. That goes back to Thomas Lodge and the Inns of Court. The rise in the interest in kind of epigrammatic writing really stems from the Inns of Court, and satire in the 1590s really stems from the Inns of Court. And Jonson is clearly influenced by that, but again, not officially a member. So you can feel the literary innovations of the inns kind of permeating and influencing, all of the writing, the other writers around the Inns of Court and in London, even if the writers aren't officially members.
Well, and I don't want to call them the graduating class of the 1560s, but technically, but that decade of writers, I mean, Thomas Heywood, you point this out because one of the chapters of your book even refers to them as Thomas Heywood called them famously, Minerva's men, referring to Pallas Athena and identifying the Inns of Court as like the home of the nation's most talented literati, as he says, begot as Pallas was of mighty Jove's brain, which is a wonderful quote, I think. These guys were astounding. Like this is a very noteworthy class of men at a period of time that is so important and does so much to shape everything that happens after that, I think.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate that it gets overlooked. So just a brief qualification. So it's Jasper Heywood, just in case you have a listener who wants to look up.
Oh, sorry, wrong Heywood.
Particular, yeah, the wrong Heywood. But so it's Jasper Heywood, uncle of John Donne, for what it's worth, and he is at the Inns of Court writing about doing this translation of Thyestes. He actually completes it at Oxford, but then moves to the Inns of Court. But he's talking about this group of writers that are, incredibly talented. And you can see him even in that preface to Thyestes, where he's talking about all of the men and listing by name these members of the inns who are writing. You can see it's remarkable. It's not something that's normal. There's something unusual happening at the inns, that there are so many writers. And
but he lists them off, and he also alludes to like each of their like most famous piece at that point, right? Like this guy's famous for writing this, and this one who's famous for writing that, and he does it in a more eloquent way, obviously, than just a list, because he's it's poetry. But the allusions there are incredible, and that laundry list is huge.
It is. For a long time, the writers of the 1560s were sort of written off as kind of the bad poets, like they were trying really hard. So C.S. Lewis famously dubbed the middle centuries of the middle of the 16th century as the drab age of English poetry, as compared to the kind of later golden age of Sidney, Spenser, Shakespeare, etc. And if you are thinking about these writers in terms of what they were able to achieve aesthetically, in terms of what we value often as modern readers, which is really shaped by those writers of the 1590s, they do seem archaic and a little drab, and they have this kind of lumbering 14er meter often in their poetry. But if we change the frame and think about them less in terms of comparison and more in terms of what they themselves might have thought they were doing, then what they were doing becomes really interesting and often really innovative. And one of the things that's most interesting about what they're doing is they're writing in English. They are writing poetry and also translating classical works into English. And so they're trying to demonstrate the kind of flexibility and power that English can have as compared to the more prestigious language of Latin. And so, by writing in multiple genres, so Barnaby Gooch, for instance, is writing eclogues, epitaphs, songs, and sonnets. That's kind of the title of his work. A lot of those works listed by Jasper Heywood in his preface to Thyestes are actually translations of the classics or continental works, and they're turning them into English. And so they're demonstrating that English has this ability to be poetic, and that later writers like Spenser or Shakespeare kind of capitalize on. But they really saw themselves as having as participating in a project to demonstrate the power that English could have as a literary language. So that's one of the things that they were doing. But I know that you also were interested in politics, and maybe that's
Well,
the
that's
direction
exactly
you want to
where
go
I
in
was going to
now.
go next.
Yeah.
Is, you point out very clearly, and I agree tremendously with everything you say in your book about this. Is they start to serve as this alternative polity, and a lot of what they're doing could be classified, and I believe is meant to be, and grouped into the area of politically charged expression. And you mentioned that it serves as sort of this proto public sphere of English discourse, because it's a collective society delivering messages that perhaps an individual might not be able to deliver without risk of being hanged or drawn and quartered, for instance, on some of the issues that they present through their works, and especially through the dramatic literature that starts to develop, the plays that are created and then presented.
Yeah, so a lot of the works that Heywood again mentions in this preface are works that are broadly in the vein of counsel to princes, sort of the advice to princes genre. So he mentions, for instance, Thomas North as his translation of Anthony of Guevara's Dial of Princes. Now we know Thomas North as the translator of Plutarch's Lives, which was an important source for Shakespeare's works. But this Dial of Princes is kind of a piece of kind of advice to princes. Similarly, he mentions Thomas Sackville, who is a co-author of the play Gorboduc, which has long been seen as offering advice to Elizabeth, kind of counsel about the succession and also about her marriage policy. So they saw themselves as using literature to offer advice, not just to the Queen, also to members of the Privy Council, to kind of the upper echelons of the English government, giving them advice about what is appropriate behavior for a prince, even as they're also using and as a a man of politics, but they're also using these works to think for themselves about the kind of person they want to be when they move into politics, whether they go into parliament or become an ambassador or go home and become a JP, things like that. So one of the points that I make in Lawyers at Play is that on the one hand, they're thinking for themselves about the kind of person they would like to be. They're also dedicating these works to often members of the Privy Council like Cecil, and they're offering advice to them. And they're also claiming a kind of authority to participate in a veiled way in contemporary politics. And sometimes they are even going further by asserting that they have that members of the Inns of Court, by virtue of their affiliation with the law, have a kind of authority and legitimacy to offer commentary on politics that is, and that it comes from a kind of separate place from kind of the monarch's authority. So they are sort of claiming the Inns of Court and claiming themselves as men, as legal men, as having a kind of authority to speak on matters of state. So Gorboduc is probably the best and clearest example of that, and I can talk a little bit about that play if you'd like.
Yeah, I do want to get to that. But so as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking to myself, well, it's sort of like this unspoken branch of government, isn't it? And then when you look at how this nation's government was formed with its three separate branches of government, you have to wonder if these men from England who helped form this nation sort of harkened back to that same philosophy of, I don't want to say philosopher kings, but of, lawyer politicians type of connection that is established truly in this era of the 1560s as it's sort of these men are getting together and over their meals in the great halls of their inns, having these discussions about nation and monarchy, and then figuring out ways to put it into their works to send messages to the higher powers of what it is that they would like to see happen or how they would like to see policy change or shift. I think that's incredible.
Yeah, one of the issues that I couldn't get into in the book, but I think it connects to this kind of broader issue in kind of the history of English governance, which has to do with the relative power of the monarch in relation to his or her council, the Privy Council, but also in relation to Parliament. And as Henry VIII is, separating from the Catholic Church, he is kind of turning to Parliament to authorize some of these decisions because Parliament kind of represents the will of the people. But what is interesting about that is that it raises the cachet and status and authority of Parliament such that there is now this kind of separate and competing entity with the power of the monarch. So in the 1560s, what is sort of interesting, there's a historian named John Guy who talks about England having a kind of mixed polity, which is a term that can be understood as loosely a kind of series of powers that we would think of like in terms of the separation of powers, where you have the monarch working with the Privy Council and the Parliament kind of all together to sort of govern the nation. And then in the latter half of Elizabeth's reign, Elizabeth becomes more authoritarian in her style of governance and is kind of, trying to limit the power of Parliament. But sort of the cat's out of the bag, or the horse has left the barn, you might say. And all of this comes to a head eventually in the English Revolution as Parliament sort of overthrows the king. But in terms of the 1560s, you can see these men sort of in subtly, but by translating all of these works that are talking about the power of counselors and talking like in Gorboduc specifically about the power of Parliament, they are arguing that there are powers that can contain the power of the monarch or limit the power of the monarch, or at the very least that the monarch really ought to listen to. And they are seeing themselves as part of that class of men who are able or will be able to offer that kind of counsel, by themselves, like Thomas Norton becomes a member of parliament, So so they are seeing themselves as moving ultimately into those positions. But they're also suggesting that the law as an entity is itself separate and distinct from the monarch, and that the monarch can be constrained also by the law and by what legal men have to say.
It's very revolutionary thinking for that time in history, and for England particularly, I think, for all of Europe for that matter. It's
Yeah,
really,
with hindsight, it looks really revolutionary, and I don't know that they understood what they were doing. I don't know how much they understood what they were doing as revolutionary. They must have a little bit. So William Baldwin's Mirror for Magistrates gets mentioned in this preface to Thyestes. And the Mirror for Magistrates was initially produced under Mary, but it was actually suppressed by Mary because it was seen to be too subversive. And then it's kind of reprinted again it's printed again successfully under Elizabeth. So they must have had some sense, and that's all about, the power of counselors and constraining the power of the king or the queen. So they must have had some inkling that what they were doing was taking a position.
it was potentially
Whether they,
dangerous.
yeah,
I think they
yeah.
understood the danger. I always say to people that I don't think today we can possibly understand what it would have been like to live underneath a monarch who had full totalitarian power over life and death with the signature of a pen of any subject beneath her, right? And Elizabeth didn't wield it crazy like her sister before her, but she did wield it, and when she did, people lost their heads. So I think that there's a layer of danger there, that a cloud so much even that they sort of live under, that they have to be cautious and careful. And by writing as a group, as a collective team of members of the Inns of Court, I think that there's safety in numbers then, right? Like there's sort of she's not going to behead us all. One of the other works you draw attention to is The Misfortunes of Arthur, written by Hughes, but in collaboration with his fellows at Gray's Inn. And so are they sort of shielding each other in some way?
I think so. Partly collaborative writing seems to have been more the norm, but at least for plays and at the Inns of Court. But partly, yeah, I think that's a nice way to think about it, that they were kind of shielding each other, and by having multiple authors and then kind of a collective production, they are able to say something maybe that they wouldn't be able to say if they were trying to speak individually.
With, like, for instance, The Misfortunes of Arthur, it's clearly a warning to the new young queen. These are the traps, these are the pitfalls that you may fall into, and if you follow this advice, you will avoid them. In Gorboduc, it is very much about, okay, the power of counselors and the power of parliament, but it's also, as many historians believe, it was, hey, you should get married and have an offspring so that you can secure the succession of the throne. Those are some pretty serious issues to be able to throw at the monarch with practical impunity, because it came from these collective men of the Inns of Court. No? Or am I misinterpreting that, do you think?
No, I don't think you're misinterpreting it. Although one of the things that has there's a few questions that have struck me. So first of all, yes, absolutely. They were saying these things that were pretty radical. So for instance, at the end of Gorboduc, one of the counselors says explicitly, so that, a king divides his realm between his two sons and abdicates the throne, sparking a disastrous civil war. The king, in doing this, doesn't listen to his counselors, and in particular, the kind of wise counselor whose name is Eubulus. His name means wise counsel. So at the end, Eubulus says, he has a speech where he says, none of this would have happened if Parliament should have been listened to, and certain heirs appointed to the crown to stay the title of established right and set the state in quiet stay. So he's saying there, you should have listened to Parliament, and you need to establish some heirs to the throne. And if you don't do that, you are courting disaster if you die. And of course, this is very early in Elizabeth's reign. And there's also an element of that play where there's a kind of potential kind of, there's a foreign invader who's kind of coming down from the north, potentially. And so there's a sense also that you have to kind of, you need to marry somebody who is local and not open up, not open up.
Was it the King of Sweden? Who there was one?
Yeah, the King of Sweden was a potential marriage.
Like he was a suitor to the Queen in her earlier days, right?
Yes,
and
that's
they're
right.
like, no, we don't want that guy. Get him out of here. But marry an Englishman.
Marry an Englishman. Don't kind of flirt with court disaster by having somebody foreign come into England. So so these are kind of radical ideas. Similarly, with the Misfortunes of Arthur, which is much later, it's actually 1587. So Elizabeth is much older. It's kind of on the eve of the Armada. But there, Arthur has left England and or has left his realm and left Mordred in charge, and Mordred and Guinevere have an affair, et cetera, but Arthur comes home and there's this kind of civil war. And there, scholars have argued that this is an argument against sort of imperial designs by England, sort of going off and taking over other countries, kind of focus on domestic politics. Don't turn your eyes elsewhere. So again, these are
look what happened
pointed comments.
I mean, it goes way back, but look what happened when Richard goes, I'm going to go crusading and leave my brother John in charge. That didn't end very well. we end up with the Magna Carta because of it, right? So I think that's still maybe very strong in their minds, especially men of the law, because the Magna Carta is such a shift in history, all based in written law, which I think is important to note, maybe.
Yeah, that's also a very nice point. So going back to your point about, are they turning to a sort of their collectivity to help to make these points? I think there's a few things going on. One is they really are banking on their background in the law and their affiliation with the Inns of Court as granting a kind of authority and license to speak. At the same time, they are often doing this in a sort of semi-coded way. They're not just saying, there's not necessarily always exact parallels. Like in Gorboduc, there's a foreign invader from the north, not a foreign suitor from the north. And so in that sense, they're speaking in a kind of code so that even as they're relying on the authority and legitimacy of the law and their legal education and the sort of sense that the Inns of Court are sort of autonomous from the monarch and kind of provide a license to speak, they are also not exploiting that license in a way that's going to get them into trouble. And so they are kind of turning to each other for some kind of cover, right? She's not going to behead all of us, but they're also not speaking as openly or as candidly as they might do. And in that sense, providing themselves some kind of like plausible deniability.
Right. There's a lot of metaphor going on
Yeah.
And also, I think to some degree, they're shielding themselves through the classical works and the writers of the classical period whose works they're translating or adapting or using as source material to say, see, this is just a version of something that has existed for hundreds of years and that we've all been learning about and all been studying about forever. And it's not really meant to stab the queen between the eyes. Not at all. No, don't look at that. Look at Seneca.
Right.
Look at Ovid.
Yeah. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking about these translations of Seneca, and in particular, so Jasper Haywood translates Thyestes, which is this kind of gross and amazing story about, two brothers. There's some conflict over the throne, and one brother, Atreus, invites his other brother, Thyestes. The king Atreus invites his brother Thyestes to kind of come back to the kingdom to sort of make some peace. And at that point, he decides that he's going to take Thyestes' children, bake them in a pie, and feed them to Thyestes as a way of getting revenge on Thyestes for, ever, having a claim to the throne in the first place. And also, it's a way of kind of eliminating him as a challenger. And the play is such a marvelous depiction of how tyranny works. So there's this great line in it where one of the counselors to Atreus says something like, wouldn't it be nice for the people to agree with what you do and to support it? And Atreus says something like, oh, no. It's so much better if the people hate it and have to mouth their support anyway. Like, that's real power. So when you're thinking about this as something that's circulating among members of the Privy Council, that particular play was dedicated to a member of the Privy Council, so as you're thinking about this as a play that's maybe circulating among that group, it does make you think, what are they saying about the operations of power, about the potential for monarchy to veer into tyranny, about how tyranny works, about the power that counselors may or may not have in order to kind of rein in a monarch. So they are using these classics as a way of thinking through some of these very delicate questions of the period.
We see that reflected throughout history. What immediately comes to mind is Jean Anouilh and his adaptation of Antigone during the German occupation, and the Germans accepting it because it's based in Greek tragedy and not seeing it as the subversive work that it really was meant to be, which is to stand up to tyranny, right? In the way that Antigone stands up to Creon in that story. And the Germans are sort of oblivious to the fact that, here he is trying to foster up some strength in the French resistance through his art. And they're like, oh, this is a great play based on Greek tragedy. We love it, kind of a thing. So it's, it's sort of continued to play out throughout the ages, this sort of, let's rely on the classics as sort of a shield for getting our message out. And hopefully people will see past the veil and through the metaphor into what the true moral is, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, what's interesting about Seneca is that it's not just maybe speaking to power or thinking about these issues of power, but it's speaking in the language that Elizabeth would have liked. Elizabeth herself translated, she actually didn't translate Seneca, but she translated some of Hercules on Eta, which was attributed to Seneca at the time. And so, this would have been something that she would have enjoyed. And so it's kind of using the language of the monarch to kind of speak about and to and about the monarch in a way.
And lots of plays about getting married in that decade.
Yes.
Lots and lots of plays about getting married. There is a common theme coming out of the Inns of Court, which is, hey, you need to get married and have a baby.
Yeah, absolutely. So the last chapter of my book is about these marriage plays at the Inns of Court and kind of how they are variously thinking about and advising, Elizabeth to get married, establish the succession, resolve the succession, please. By the time many of these plays had come out, she had had smallpox and, nearly died. And so they are urging her, it's kind of 6 ways to Sunday, as the as the saying goes, to get married. And of course, she resists, and doesn't do it. But they see themselves as having the kind of authority and legitimacy to weigh in, to offer their opinions, however veiled, on that topic.
And I'd say that the other side of the coin, like the other collection of work that you see, besides all the translations, is, works that feel like they are written about and for fellow innsmen. Like, lawyers writing for lawyers type of a situation where isn't this an issue that we should all be considering because we are men of the law? Or isn't this a funny series of jokes because we all get it because we are all men of the law? It seems to me to be a lot of the other side of the coin of the works that were coming out at that time.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things, so when I started my work on this book, I started it as a dissertation, and it was originally titled Literature and Politics at the Early Elizabethan Inns of Court. And, nearly everyone asked me, well, where's the law in this? And it was a question that took me a while to be able to answer, because one of the things that struck me as I was reading this literature is that it didn't seem to me to engage the specifics of the law, like specific legal cases, or use a lot of legal terminology. I felt like, at first glance, it just didn't seem very legal to me. I mean, there weren't plays that staged kind of legal cases or legal scenes in the way that, some later Elizabethan, like The Merchant of Venice or something like that does.
Mm-hmm.
So, I was just thinking, where is the law here? And so oftentimes what they're talking about when they're talking to each other about being Inns of Courtmen, they're not so much talking about legal precedent, legal cases, in jokes on law French terms, things like that. Instead, what they're doing is they're talking about the kinds of issues that they, as magistrates, as kind of men of business in Parliament, as kind of men involved in the governance of the state, will have to be aware of and to consider, like how much power should a monarch have? What role does a counselor have relative to the person that they're counseling? And they're also often thinking about issues of kind of personal comportment. And so I have a chapter on poetry that circulated at the inns that talks about how the men are often talking to each other about not being too ambitious or trying to avoid the entanglements of love, and being self-controlled in the face of anger, things like that, that are not necessarily legalistic, but they are about kind of representing oneself.
Neither a borrower
Civilly,
nor a lender
professionally. Be. Yeah.
Like those types of
Professionally
precepts,
and civilly,
right?
Yeah, a lot of it is that. But so in some sense, they are talking to each other about being lawyers, but they're not actually talking about the law in the nitty-gritty detail that we might expect if we're thinking, oh, these are a bunch of lawyers talking about legal, writing literature. You would expect more legal concepts to appear, but they don't seem to be there in any way that matters.
That's interesting because I want to jump ahead 30 years, and you don't really cover the 1590s in your book, but you do allude to them in your introduction a lot, particularly as sort of the Renaissance of the Renaissance in certain ways. And as you mentioned, between you have the 1560s, you have the 1590s, the 1610s, and the 1630s. And I think that the flow through there always, to me, is the question of succession. Then the 1560s, you have a new queen. They're saying you should get married. In the 1590s, you have an aging queen. They're saying we need to do something about who's going to be the next monarch. 1610, you have a new monarch, and people aren't real happy with some of the things he's doing. By 1630, he's gone nuts and gone, and his son sucks. And so I feel like there's like a pattern here of the Inns of Court sort of rising to the occasion when there are concerns about the monarchy or monarchical rule. And in the 1590s, we see this sort of revolution of playwrights that are both connected to the Inns of Court or pseudo connected to the Inns of Court, and then also absolutely not connected. But many of the plays in the first folio of Shakespeare, I feel, read like plays that were written about and for the members of the Inns of Court. And indeed, many of those plays can trace their first performances to the Inns of Court. Thus my belief that what happened in the 1560s sort of sets the foundation for everything that happens afterwards.
So I think there's a few lines to kind of run down there that I think support kind of like get at what you're saying, but also maybe qualify it to some degree. So first, just to continue the line about, there's all this writing, but it doesn't seem all that legal. I do think that continues in much of the Inns of Court writing from the 1590s. So I've mentioned John Davis's epigrams and also Thomas Lodge's Apilia, and John Marston also has an Apillion. And though that kind of satiric epigrammatic writing and the kind of like lusty Ovidian poetry, that has often seemed to me to be similar to what's going on in the 1560s poetry, in that in a variety of ways, it's also thinking about decorum and appropriate behavior, and sort of sometimes unexpectedly, but sort of thinking about what the limits of professional decorum are and kind of what you can and can't do. So I talk about John Davis's epigrams. I've talked about them in a different article about how, we see these poems as kind of scurrilous and critical of all these different types in society, including various kind of Inns of Court types. And he has an epigram about Publius, the student at common law, who spends all of his time at the bear baiting rings and at plays, and kind of gets covered in, filth in doing so, and kind of that reveals his personality. And we see them as kind of critical, just kind of this kind of whirling criticism of everyone around him, partly coming from the sort of anger of how he's been treated by Richard Martin, et cetera, that we talked about. But in many ways, you can see it maybe as trying to think about what appropriate behavior is for a lawyer, and should you be the kind of person who's kind of going to all these plays, or becoming violent, or showing off your professional the language that you have by kind of using law French in public and suggesting that you have a kind of secret knowledge, things like that. So on the one hand, a lot of the Inns of Court writing is similar in that it's like kind of not that legalistic. And similarly, although the play The Misfortunes of Arthur, which is 1587, 1588, you can tie that to obviously to questions about succession. It's a little harder to see some of the other plays of the 1590s in and around the Inns of Court as specifically about succession, maybe The Malcontent or something like that by Marston. But where those questions really seem to become energized, and here I'm sort of thinking off the top of my head, so you can come back at me.
That's okay.
But those questions are really energized in the space of the public theaters and also the private theaters like Blackfriars, and kind of in the 1590s and later. And so, I mean, I think what's interesting about that is that those are spaces that are populated by members of the Inns of Court. They're going to these playhouses a lot and they're seeing these plays, but they're not necessarily writing them. you know, um, Marlowe was not a member of the Inns of Court,
Right.
and
And we talked about
Shakespeare's not,
Johnson not
Johnson,
being a
yeah,
member.
but but questions of succession really animate so much of their plays, particularly the tragedies, and so it's kind of interesting that there's this kind of context that is maybe like energized by members of the Inns of Court in some way, but those questions, I don't know. I mean, I'd have to think about it more, but I don't know that they're really coming up in, if you kind of draw the harder line around what an Inns of Court writer is. I don't know that they're necessarily coming up as much in the kind of Inns of Court writing as it is in the kind of broader kind of popular writing of the time.
Well, we'd mentioned Johnson, and obviously Johnson's works were influenced by the early works of Inns of Court writers. I think that's clear, and I think he sort of tips his hat to them on occasion. You talk about Marlowe. We could talk about Fletcher, and obviously Shakespeare. I think a lot of those plays, specifically many of the plays of Shakespeare, I think read a lot like the collected counsel of a magistrate class directed specifically at the monarch, the way those earlier plays were created and designed, similar to Gorboduc, similar to, well, Arthur starts it off in the late 80s, right? And I think when we look at the fact that many of those plays saw early recorded performances at Hampton Court or at Whitehall, then we tend to have more evidence that these plays were written perhaps with one audience member in mind, the Queen. How does...
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, I was going to say, I guess for me, I see plays like, let's say, Richard II or Richard III as or all those the history plays. I see them maybe as more deliberative than didactic, and in that sense they're a little bit different from something like Gorboduc, which is it has it's sort of haranguing. And
that's a great word. That's the other thing. I will warn everybody, when you get Jessica's book, be prepared, because she has a Shakespearean vocabulary, ladies and gentlemen, and you will be turning to your dictionary on occasion to say, wait a minute, have I ever seen that word before? You're such an eloquent writer about a topic that can otherwise, with lesser writers, would feel maybe a little mundane or a little too academic for most people. But of course, our listener base, they love this stuff and they eat it up like candy. But I do want to warn you all, Quiller Nation, she is very verbose and has a magnificent vocabulary.
Thank you. I think maybe not. In any case, yeah. So I don't know. I don't know that they're the same as the plays of the 1560s in the level. I mean, I think that they're not as didactic.
So they're more subtle. The use of metaphor has better developed, perhaps.
And also, sometimes it's not so much about like with Henry IV Part 1. It's not. You can read it as obviously like the story of the development of a king and kind of what a good king should be, and kind of the things that you have to cast off in order to be a king. You basically have to die a little death, right? By casting off the life that is Falstaff in order to be a king. So in that sense, if you read it that way, it's didactic. At the same time, so much of the play seems to be, or at least my conversations with students, I mean, they really wrestle with the question of like, is Hal a kind of a good person or not? And to what extent does that matter in terms of being a king? And in that sense, I feel like the play is raising a question about kind of decorum, behavior, personality relative to monarchy, not so much offering a kind of statement about the role of, the about the power of the monarch or the power of the parliament, or something like that. So in that sense, like there's an example where I'd say it seems more deliberative, sort of provoking thought, rather than necessarily offering a kind of counsel.
Well, do we not, in that instance, see Hal as sort of casting off the title of reveler? We learn that he actually, I got a frog in my throat today. We learn that he actually has been doing his share of plotting somehow, somewhere, because he obviously has the knowledge. But he has to transform into an ancient, like, immediately, in order to take on the reins of the kingdom. So could that not be a message by Innsman for Innsman of what the progression of a young nobleman or a young courtier or even the young son of the gentry who is going through the Inns of Court needs to embrace and to fulfill?
I mean, it's a fascinating reading. I mean, it could be. Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting way for me to think about it. I haven't thought about it like that before. And in that sense, it could be. So Hal represents something like an Inns of Court man rather than, the king to be. So I think something within the play that would potentially support that, even if it's a pretty subtle moment, is Hal tells Falstaff he's going to give him his commission at the temple. He says, I'll meet you at the temple.
Right.
And that's where we're, tomorrow. And so it's sort of signaling, this is the moment where he's kind of maybe hoping that Falstaff will transform. And of course, Falstaff doesn't, but it's the moment of his transformation. From that point on, he is, where he sort of says, I'll meet you at the temple. He has become he has announced, but now he embraces his change. So in that sense, there is this kind of moment that ties Hal directly to the Inns of Court environment at the moment when he's transforming. So
it's a similar moment
possible.
in Julius Caesar, right? Where you have the conspirators talking about Antony and they say, oh, goodness gracious. He is nothing but a reveler. In fact, that's the exact quote. They use that term, reveler, about him. So they dismiss him as being unimportant and not necessary to kill because he is inconsequential and he cares more about drinking and partying and going to see plays than he does about statehood. But then what Antony delivers is probably the best closing argument any lawyer has ever delivered in front of the most massive jury of all time and causes a civil war. And so I also feel like there are reflections of, the Inns of Court in that play as well. And the message being sent not only to maybe the monarch to some degree about tyrannical rule, but I think even more so to those who would rise up against that or conspire against that. The warning is you could send us all into oblivion. And also don't underestimate those who you have minimized through reputation as a reveler, because that could come back to bite you if they are able to transcend to the level of applauding ancient.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is, in terms of thinking about those plays and a kind of broader public audience, as well as a sort of sizable Inns of Court audience, to what I mean, this is a question that, you know, often comes up when you're thinking about audience and kind of interpreting in relation to the sort of ideas in the play in relation to a certain segment of the audience. To what extent is Shakespeare writing specifically with this particular group in mind? And to what extent is he kind of weaving a story that appeals on multiple levels so that, the story of Hal, on the one hand, can be viewed as the story of a king. It can be just about, a kind of prodigal son coming into his own, um, which could appeal just to sort of a random member of the audience. It could be about a reveler becoming a plotter. So in that sense, is it just that the story itself speaks on multiple levels, or is it that it's actually being designed with a particular resonance in mind, and then it just kind of happens to have these other layers? So
Well, one of the
so I don't
things that
know.
I've found so difficult throughout my study and my work with the works of Shakespeare is when we look at how many of them, where we see first recorded performances either at the Inns of Court or at some place like Hampton Court or Whitehall, and then so many plays that we don't see at all until the first folio. So you have to wonder, well, where were those plays and what were they doing? Were they being circulated among a certain audience? Were they performed and we just don't know about it? Were they performed under a previous title or an earlier version? Because we do have a lot of court performances that mention plays that are very similar to the titles that we find in the first folio. And so I guess what I wonder is, how did that happen? Like, how did this writer's plays get access to be performed at the Inns of Court or at Hampton Court or at Whitehall? What connection does this writer have to the Inns of Court or to Elizabeth's court that his plays are being presented sometimes for the very first time for this select, very elite audience? And is that not some evidence that maybe many of the titles that we find for the first time in the first folio were also written for that select audience and not for the public?
Mhm. I mean, I think in terms of Whitehall, the answer is maybe, just the master of the revels. I mean, all of these things have to be licensed, and I mean, my understanding is the office came into being as a way of basically finding plays that could be performed at court. And so in that sense, the process of licensing gives the possibility of access to performance at court, because all of these plays are being read through, um, from an office whose history is to find plays to entertain the monarch. So I think that process partly explains the access to Whitehall. In terms of the Inns of Court, it's maybe less of a puzzle around the comedy of errors. I don't know around Twelfth Night, and of course it's probable or quite possible that Troilus and Cressida was performed at the Inns. Um, so we do know that. So in terms of professional playwrights at the Inns, we do know that after about the 1560s, many masques were written by members of the Inns of Court, but they still had plays that they still brought in professional playwrights, or they hired professional play companies to perform at the Inns. So Alan Nelson in these records of early English drama read volumes talks about a bunch of professional plays that are kind of now lost, but that were performed at the Inns of Court. So one called Hyde Park, another called the Oxford Tragedy, another called the Bridegroom and the Madman. So, just there are a series of they're hiring in professionals to perform there, and they're also often hiring professional musicians to come in for the revels. So, in that sense, the access could just happen from kind of looking around and seeing sort of who's big in town or, things like that. We also know that sometimes there were productions that overlapped in terms of their personnel, so that there were sometimes professional players as well as members of the Inns of Court kind of within the same production. So um, uh, there's an interesting detail that Alan Nelson brings out in the Reed volumes that there was like a masque in 1613, and it mentions that the Lincoln's Inn actually bought stockings for that masque for Hemming's boy, which is probably a reference to the son of John Hemmings. And so, there's kind of overlapping personnel in that masque, and he gives some other examples. So it seems like they're on the lookout for professional playwrights, professional productions. There's a long history of hiring in professional musicians, and a kind of newer history after the 1560s of hiring in professional playwrights to do the plays themselves. So, how Shakespeare in particular gets there, I mean, it's an interesting question. In 1594, it seems to me to be a little bit possible. I mean, it's possible. So he's just written, or he's, working on, so 1594 is the date of the rape of Lucrece
Right.
and Venus and Adonis. And he dedicates those to the Earl of Southampton, who is a member of Gray's Inn. And so, there's a possibility that, there's a kind of connection to the Inns of Court there. Now, in terms of, so that may be why he ends up at the kind of Gray's Inn revels in 1594, has to do with the Earl of Southampton. How it is that Twelfth Night ends up there, I don't know. They liked twins.
It is interesting because I'm in the middle of our season right now, and one of the plays we're doing right now is Comedy of Errors, and next season we are doing Twelfth Night. So it's we're kind of going from one set of twins to another in back-to-back seasons. But it is interesting that twins show up in the Inns of Court as like this mechanism that seems to be entertaining to the legal class for some reason during that period. Because those two specifically see early performances for, and when you look at them and you analyze them, especially in Comedy of Errors, there are sequences that are so boring to a modern audience, even though they're meant to be hilariously funny. And it's because you have one Dromio or the other going on a rant of jokes that are specifically aimed at people who are lawyers or students of the law. I mean, it's pretty obvious that that's what he's doing. He's, playing up to the audience before him. And I just always find it interesting that, so we have this evidence that plays of Shakespeare look to be written specifically for this legal audience at times, and evidence that that's where they saw first performance. And it makes you wonder, one, how can he have such knowledge of the law to be able to write so specifically for that audience? Two, how does he get access to have his plays performed there? And one of the great mysteries for me of the entire period is, who is directing these productions, especially if it's being performed by members of the Inns of Court, for members of the Inns of Court? We never have any record of who was the guy telling them the blocking, telling them what to do, holding the prompt book, feeding them lines if they needed it. That's one of the saddest things for me as a producer director, is that we have very little history of the role of a director through this very important period of dramatic literature and dramatic performance. It's kind of shocking, in fact.
Yeah, Tiffany Stern talks a little bit about this role of the kind of prompter in performances or in rehearsals, but it is something. I mean, I've often wondered whether there was, we talk about oral formulaic poetry for Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, whereby, there are certain kind of set pieces, like the sun rising with its rose red fingers, or, this is the kind of thing that happens when people sit down to a feast, or these are the kinds of elements of, an armor, a warrior putting on armor. I have sometimes wondered if there was something like performance formulas, so that, when there's a battle scene, there are maybe set standards for how a battle is done, in a particular company. Like, we have these 4 people and those 4 people, and they're going to do these types of things. And then we'll have our main characters come out on this side of the stage and do XYZ. And so I have sometimes wondered if because the plays were rehearsed so quickly, written and rehearsed so quickly, I've just wondered if there isn't an element of a formula in some types of scenes.
If we could just find somebody's journal somewhere that says, well, today we were working on this play and that asshole Jack Kemp was so difficult at rehearsal, or just anything like that. I mean, because directors complain about actors all the time. The closest thing we have is we have certain noblemen who put on big pageants or reenactments of battles in history, mainly for the queen and for her court as a sort of type of performance. And we do have record of which nobleman funded it and basically directed it, right? Because he served as producer, funding, and director of the events. There's a very famous one where they're shooting cannons and they burn down half a village because they overshoot and hit some houses. And in fact, it was the Earl of Oxford. He had to help pay for the homes that burned down. The Queen thought it was awesome, but also said, you need to pay for that. So we do have that, but we don't really have the role of the director. And I'm wondering, does the playwright serve as the director? And if so, what would that look like if a playwright is brought into the Inns of Court with his play and now is suddenly directing these lawyers and students of the law in how to perform his work? That doesn't seem to sit right with me as something that could or would have happened.
Well, it's not clear that, it's not clear that the Comedy of Errors was performed by members of the Inns, right?
Well, it is because then they're so upset with, in that instance, they do talk about there being sort of a producer of the evening. They never name him, but they do talk about how when things go wrong, and I put that in air quotes because they're making a big farce out of the evening, they put him on trial for being responsible for this night of errors, including that they ran out of liquor apparently at one point because it was held at Middle Temple, but members of the other inns came to the evening and it was too packed. It was they couldn't fit everybody and they ran out of wine and it was hot and stuffy and people were crowded. And so they blamed it on the producer, whoever this man was. They put him on trial and found him guilty and crowned a basically king of misrule to render sentence upon him. So that's all in the journals and the writings of the people who attended.
Mm-hmm.
And so that.
But I thought that the issue was that people were crowding onto the stage while the play was going on. And so that caused the sort of,
the whole thing fell apart. Yeah. The whole thing fell apart.
I don't, and certainly with Twelfth Night. So in the Gesta Graeorum, there's a line that kind of denigrates the players of the play as a company of base and common fellows. So there, the players,
were outsiders.
Are outsiders. They're the professional players. And so in that instance, I'd have to go back and look at, I'm sorry, the Gesta Graeorum is I'm sorry, I'm getting confused, is about the Night of Errors. It's it's denigrating the company as base and common fellows.
Now, is that metaphorical, as in you're nothing but a base knave, you're a villain?
I don't know.
Because they often would, throw insults at each other that way, especially if it's out of criticism.
But if it's Shakespeare's plays, like some of these other professional plays that are being put on and the professional musicians that are being hired, they're hiring in professionals. They're not, with the masks. I mean, I think it's another question with the masks, which are often still being written by members of the Inns of Court and being performed by members of the Inns of Court. And so there's a question there about kind of who is, who's doing what and how the whole entertainment is being directed. But for the professional productions, I mean, there's an interesting question still about who is the actual director, kind of who's the Peter Quince here.
Yeah.
But they would have been professional players, not directing members of the Inns. Although there are some instances in Alan Nelson's book of masks that have both professional players in them, as I mentioned, and members of the Inns of Court. So that's an interesting dynamic.
Well, you could imagine, a star student or somebody who's very popular, or even one of the quote unquote ancients who decides he's going to do a cameo in the performance before all of his fellows would be something the audience would love to see. I mean, we love to see it today, right? We look for little cameo performances of stars in certain movies, even that delight the audience. For instance, when Linda Carter shows up at the end of the latest Wonder Woman movie, as an example, right? So I could see where that would certainly be an aspect. It's very possible, and we have to some degree some evidence that there were even members of Elizabeth's court who appeared in some of the performances that were delivered before her. And that would make sense as well because of that same reason. We have instances where members of the court appeared before James in performances of masks and dances, both for him. So it's sort of like, it feels like it was easy to say, oh, those lowly actors, but everybody still seemed to want to some degree have their moment in the footlights, as it were, at various levels of the government and of the hierarchy. Mm-hmm. We talked about...
Go ahead.
I was going to say, we've talked about sort of the dangers of the Minerva's men of the 1560s. Do you think that the late 1580s and 1590s was a more dangerous time to be writing about issues facing the queen or trying to influence her? Did she become less susceptible to that type of, let's call it, guidance from these men? Did it become more risky to touch on things like succession? Or I know she made it illegal to even talk about who the next monarch would be or face death. Do you think that had an impact and an effect on what was coming out of the Inns as well as what was coming out of the other writers of the time?
I think it wasn't more dangerous. I mean, I don't know. But it does seem like the writing in general becomes more veiled, and there's in its potential criticism of the monarch. So, on the one hand, Shakespeare's history plays are kind of all about succession and all about kind of how a king should behave and what their relationship to their, to the polity should be. At the same time, it's all done at such a distance. And also, one of the points that the scholar Richard Helgerson makes about the history plays is that even as they're thinking about governance, they are in general, not always, I mean, the Henry VI rebellion with the commoners is an exception, but they're so concerned with just the aristocracy. And in that sense, they're kind of highly conservative. They're not really all that interested in the commoners. And of course, then there's a line of criticism that entirely criticizes that. But so my point here is that the ways of thinking about governance become so much more deliberative, but also so much more veiled. So they're less the points that are being made are less pointed, and the ways that they're being made, allow this kind of continued plausible deniability. And so it seems like, it must be more dangerous.
But without, so then the next question I would have is, without that collective shield that the men, that Minerva's men were able to sort of enjoy, which was this sort of group work, the societal message, the play that's been written by several members, or one member's name is on it, but it mentions that it was with collaboration of other fellows of his Inn of Court. Without that, how does the playwright of the 1590s survive having a hand chopped off or a head lobbed off for these sometimes very subversive, very seditious messages within these plays?
I mean, sometimes they didn't, right? So Johnson is imprisoned for the Isle of Dogs.
Nash, I think, was tortured to the point that later on in life it ended up killing him. They didn't kill him at the time, but the injuries he suffered shortened his life.
And, many of these kind of epigrams, were banned under the bishop's ban, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, there is an official censor. And so in some sense, I mean, it sounds weird to say you might be protected by the fact of censorship. But, I think about that famous line censoring, is it the play of Sir Thomas More? But it's just, where the censor writes in the margins, leave out the insurrection wholly and the cause thereof, and start, here instead. And so in some sense, the fact of having a master of the revels who is censoring all the plays allows you to write and not be, had to have your hand chopped off or burned at the stake or have it to flee into exile, because whatever is being put on has been approved. Now, did some plays still potentially go too far or touch too much on politics? I mean, there's the famous Richard II, Elizabeth, I am Richard II, know ye not that.
Mm-hmm.
There are, so in any case, there are moments where these plays get deployed in political contexts and come to have meaning that either was there and is kind of activated, or to have kind of new resonance as a consequence of their context. At the same time, all of the plays are read and licensed. And so that keeps the plays from being censored once they're in performance in a lot of cases.
Well, I guess what I'm seeing, especially after having read your book and learning so much now about that decade of the 1560s, is that there was this model presented by members of the Inns of Court for how to work collectively to put together a message to send to the monarch through performance, an art form that she generally, we know, appreciated and loved. And that model sort of disappears in the 70s, because many of those men of the 60s go on to very prominent political careers. As we mentioned earlier, we talked about, that some of them became ambassadors. And maybe that was part of the point of what they were doing, is they were writing, demonstrating their ability at statecraft, demonstrating their ability to counsel, and then later achieved appointments to positions of counsel or of ambassadorship, which might have been the entire goal from the get start with them. I'm not certain, but it sort of looks that way. But then when we get to this next era, we'll call it, of the late 80s and 90s, that model should still be in effect and could still be used. And in places where it's not used, Johnson, Nash, Marlowe, they suffer. And there's a lot of discussion in the last decade or so about the sort of collaboration theory that maybe Shakespeare was actually working with the other writers. Some writers we've already now said, okay, well, that's part Shakespeare, part Fletcher. We're starting to realize that there was sort of this circle maybe of people all working together. And is that the model that possibly we're looking at? And maybe that included members of Inns of Court, and that's why we see so much legal erudition in the plays and so much political philosophy in the plays that otherwise we would have difficulty attributing to a guy from Stratford.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. To what extent are the Inns of Court in the 1560s an instance of a kind of larger phenomenon, which is like groups of writers coalescing and like intellectuals coalescing at various places and times and kind of doing interesting things together? And to what extent are they a model or a pattern that is being followed either with awareness or because, it's kind of like in the water? And I don't know. I mean, I think my thinking has, would tend to be more the former, in the sense that, you have a kind of intellectual group at the Inns of Court in the 1560s. In the 1590s, you have these kind of clusters of overlapping intellectual groups, whether it's, the Mermaid's Tavern and the Inns of Court and the kind of area south of the Thames with the theaters.
Fisher's Folly. Fisher's Folly definitely needs to be grouped into that.
Yeah, and so you have this kind of like sudden sort of efflorescence of intellectual activity that some of which is at the Inns of Court, but some of which is kind of in other locations, and some of which is definitely associated with the public theaters. This kind of like new thing with all of these artists kind of working on this kind of in this lively environment on this new thing and kind of energizing it. And so, I think I would be more likely to just say, well, what happens at the Inns of Court in the 1560s is related to what happens to the Inns of Court in the 1590s, in the sense that the legal profession continues to adapt and change, and sort of it's energizing the writing at the Inns of Court in a new way. At the same time, there's something larger going on in London that is kind of prompting the emergence of these other sort of clusters of writers and these other kind of industries of writing kind of to come about. To what extent does collaboration always provide plausible deniability and cover? Yeah, and it also just makes the work easier. I mean, if you get along. So,
well, I noticed you do have you have a lot of thank yous in your introduction for people who assisted you, so you must get along with a collaborative group quite well.
To what extent does it suggest that various playwrights, whether Middleton, Shakespeare, Marlowe, Nash, Johnson, to what extent were writers turning to each other or working with each other, particularly playwrights, in order to provide a kind of cover? And to what extent were they just like trying to feed the machine of this new theater, developing theater industry that just needed to, appeal, continue to appease and appeal to and garner this huge audience? I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question. I think I would be more likely to say that the collaboration is more about, just in general trying to like feed the beast of this new industry. Although certainly with like Beaumont and Fletcher, but to what extent was it about trying to provide cover? I don't know, because Shakespeare is more of an outlier. I mean, Johnson also, in that they tended to write more by themselves than with others, particularly Johnson. But also Shakespeare.
Well, Johnson had such a
Yeah.
giant ego. I mean, I don't
Yeah,
know that he could
right.
get along with or
Um,
work well with just about anybody. So,
But a lot of the other works that weren't dramatic are definitely are primarily single authored. They're single translators, single authors, single. And so although they're being written sometimes in the context of a particular culture or community, like John Donne circulating his poetry at the Inns of Court and, having that group of readers kind of energize what he's his writing. So I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting thesis.
well, I'm certain you obviously, as a guest of this program, you did your research on, where I stand on this. And I truly believe that the name William Shakespeare is a franchise, is a brand that was created to protect those who were behind the name. And I believe it was a collaboration of men, and I believe most of them members of the Inns of Court, some of them playwrights brought in to assist with the structural part of the drama. But I just feel that the erudition that we see, especially in areas of the law and of areas of courtly manners and courtly sports and just, foreign policy and knowledge of foreign lands and the different ambassadors from different countries that are lampooned in certain plays. I mean, it seems to me that this would have been the model that was created in the 1560s that smart men of the 90s would follow and figure out a way to continue to advance the wills of their fellow insmen with the monarch and with the Privy Council through this system that was so successfully used before, and obviously would have now a working tradition that they wouldn't just abandon. I don't feel.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's other examples in theatrical history of a kind of corporate production of plays.
Not necessarily plays, but certainly films end up having multiple writers. Almost every television series has a cadre of writers that all gather together and develop the characters and then decide, okay, well, this episode's going to go this way and the character arc is going to shift here and go that way. Every late night talk show has a cadre of comic writers. Saturday Night Live has notoriously created some of the best comics in the world and mostly out of the writing room. So it's certainly something that we still see today as being a model that works and works extremely well.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting is, most of these other plays that we do know are collaboratively written have, you know, The Misfortunes of Arthur has 5 authors, but that's highly unusual. I mean, mostly it's 2. And although the group of people putting on the play obviously would be larger, but the kind of writing team is generally credited to be kind of 2, whether it's Sackville and Norton or Beaumont and Fletcher or whatever. Um, so it's 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 one question is, why would this kind of corporate group kind of be different? Because there doesn't seem to be evidence for that kind of corporate writing, from the Inns of Court in the 1560s, although there is evidence of, large scale collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
I do wonder, I mean, it's the interesting thing about that thesis to me is, we think about Shakespeare as so modern in so many ways, right? So if Shakespeare is, has these modern ideas about love and romance, and he has modern ideas about politics, and he has modern ideas, blah blah blah, about what an individual is and how the human psyche works. This is another way that Shakespeare, whether a corporate as a potential corporate entity, becomes modern also, in that this there really, I don't know of a precedent in the period or prior, but maybe there's one, of that kind of corporate production. And so it's just interesting to think about, if you think about this as an industry, sort of like television or film or something, it's another way that Shakespeare becomes like undeniably like modern before his time.
Sure, definitely setting the model to then that would then later be followed. Makes it, that's true. And another example I can think of in history that's obviously way after Shakespeare's time, but it's the Algonquin Club in New York, where you had Dorothy Parker and F. Scott Fitzgerald, and this whole group of writers and artists who all kind of hung out together to share their thoughts, their ideas. And though they didn't really produce collaborative works, they sort of served as this like think tank, very much like the members of the Inns of Court were sort of serving. Is how I feel from reading your book, is that you had these men who would get together and say, well, here's the issue of the day, or here's the issue of the week, or here's what we're facing. Let's all discuss it and figure out what the best course of action is moving forward. And I think that helped shape not only the politics of England, obviously, certainly the literature of England, but the English language as a whole as well. Because as you pointed out, suddenly these men are writing in English and producing great literary works and translations in their native tongue for the first time throughout history, and changed the face of the world. It's the most commonly spoken language on the planet now in areas of the world, maybe not in general population, because obviously Mandarin and whatnot, but in areas of the world, English blankets more of the world than any other language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That doesn't happen without them.
No, I mean, it definitely takes longer without them.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it was already happening a little bit like with the Book of Common Prayer, but I mean, I don't know. I don't know that you need a corporate author in order to explain the politics of Shakespeare's plays. I mean, when I think about all of these tragedies, whether, Marlowe, Fletcher, Beaumont, Johnson, Middleton, Marston.
Let's not forget Kidd.
Kidd, yeah. When I think about these, I think about a group that is preoccupied with questions that are quite similar to what was coming up in the 1560s, like what is the nature of the monarch's power? What limits the monarch's power? How is the succession decided? What happens if there is no succession? What is the monarch's responsibility to the people? But I see, those issues are coming up so frequently across so much of the literature of the period. It's hard for me to think that someone would need collaboration as a kind of cover. It seems like when there is collaboration, there's another maybe practical reason for it, rather than practical in terms of just getting the work done, rather than practical in terms of like, protecting oneself. But it's an interesting hypothesis.
Well, and
sure,
generationally, if you look at, so if we were, let's say we just pick a date and we go 1565, the middle of that great decade, right? The newest members of the Inns of Court are now 15, 16 years old at that time. Mm-hmm. By the time we hit 1585, they're now in their 30s. What they witnessed and saw in their earliest days at the Inns of Court, of the older men around them doing all these translations and using dramatic literature as a means to help shape the country and to help shape the law. Do you think that's not lost on them, is it? I mean, then now that they're in their 30s and they're the older men, they're the quote unquote ancients now, does that not seem to me, to me it seems like that's something they wouldn't easily forget, and that they would then build upon those foundations because they remember their earliest days as members of the Inns of Court and watching all this stuff happen around them.
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting is that they don't. Like somebody like Alexander Neville or Thomas Norton, John Studley, they just they give up writing. They go on to careers in various ways. Neville keeps writing a little bit, but they go on to their careers. They make a living in a religious office, or they go into parliament, or they move back home and manage their estate. And I mean, that's one of the other puzzles of the book is like, why did this kind of political sphere sort of just disappear? And how can we, as scholars who are looking back, saying, there is clearly an emergence of public political discourse over the end of the 16th century and into the 17th century that culminates in a revolution. But when we try to track the trajectory of that through individuals or clusters, networks of intellectuals that were interested in these topics, what you see are these almost like bubbles emerging from the bottom of the ocean in separate but close proximity to each other or something. It's almost like, is this one of these ideas like with evolution, like certain adaptations like eyes, develop in, multiple animals at multiple times in multiple ways. And it's just very useful. And so there's not like a linear progression to the evolutionary development of eyes. So is the public sphere like that? It's just something that is like inevitable, where you have these clusters and groups that start, you know, as it becomes clear that the monarch is fallible, that that parliament has power, is it inevitable that there's a kind of emergence of public discourse about those issues? And it just is it's happening in different ways and different times and different places. The tragedy of Miriam, Amelia Lanier's Salve Deus Rex Judeorum. These are women who are, connected in various ways to court, but they're completely outside of these literary networks, and they're thinking about these issues. So is it just that the emergence of these issues is inevitable? Or is there a way that we can draw a kind of direct line, or even see a kind of model for political discourse that is developing over time? Um, but it's hard to draw those direct lines of influence. It's very difficult, at least with the Inns of Court, to directly connect even some of the political writing of the Inns of Court, let's say, or Inns of Court writers, like let's say some of Marston's plays, um, with it's hard to see the direct line of influence from the 1560s.
It feels like
It's
a certain number of them were sort of bought off in a certain way. Like, okay, well, we're going to give you this political appointment. Now stop writing your stuff. Be quiet and accept your piece of the pie. You have ascended to a partial portion of the power. And I feel like, people like Cecil, for instance, Walsingham, I feel like these were men who could easily negotiate and broker those kinds of deals. All right, you've made your point. You're a good writer. You have a lot to say. You're right. You should be a part of the elite class. And so you're going to be the ambassador to this country, and you're going to be the ambassador to that country, and you're going to be a magistrate over here. Like, is there some of that maybe?
I mean, I've always seen it as they grew up in a educational system, to me, that emphasized that education was for service. The purpose of education was to develop the rhetorical skills and ability, the comportment, the background, the knowledge base to be able to serve the Commonwealth. And so
For Queen
these
and Country.
men, yeah, Queen and Country, exactly. And so once they are beyond the Inns of Court and kind of set up in their professional lives, they don't need that writing anymore. They have developed the skills they need. They have used the writing that they did have to try to make professional connections and try to develop their own sense of, self in the world. But they they don't need it anymore. And so they have what their education was what they were supposed to do with all of the writing that they did in their educations and at the Inns of Court informally, which was, they have gotten the brass ring, a position, a living, and so that an office, and that's why they're not writing anymore. That's how I've interpreted it, is that the literary, they're, Gascoigne, Gouge, Turberville, these men are driven to write for sure. But at the same time, they want to serve the state. Well, maybe not Gascoigne, but they want
I was going to say,
serve
I don't
the
know,
state.
really?
Yeah.
He's sort of an outlier, I think.
So this falls off in the same way that, students in college, don't hate me, but they're writing a lot of creative writing while they're in college, and they're thinking about themselves and themselves in the world, and they have a kind of literary network and community. But ultimately they're going to college in order to kind of get out and get a job or do the thing, and that falls away, maybe with some sorrow. Like John Dolman, translates some Cicero, because he says, like, I really just missed all of this Cicero when I was in college, and I'm going to do it again. But, so some of them are just, but it just falls away as you get older and
Sure.
get a living.
Sure. That makes sense. Well, Jessica, one of the things that, I could talk to you for hours. Obviously, we've covered so much ground and there's so much more we could cover. But one of the things that I truly appreciate about you and about this conversation is you are so knowledgeable, but yet you are not one of those stuffy professor types who claims to know everything and have the answers to everything. And oftentimes in the conversation, you have said, it's hard to draw a line from this to this, or one of the great mysteries is this, or one of the difficulties is that. And I so appreciate that candor about this area of study and about this area of history from you. But what I will say is, whatever you do, don't sell yourself short, because I believe this book, Lawyers at Play, gives us an excellent roadmap to try to answer some of those questions and to draw those lines. And I appreciate it so much. And I appreciate you taking the time to come and discuss it with me for my listeners.
Well, I appreciate that you invited me to this conversation. It's been great. And it's made me think in new ways. It's kind of pressed me to think in a variety of ways, particularly about the 1590s and the literary culture of the 1590s that I haven't thought about before. So I've appreciated that.
I hope that will be your next book, that you'll dive into how those two decades are similar and different and how one fed upon the other, because I think that that's definitely material for another book.
Well, thank you. And it's been great to talk with you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it is Jessica Winston, Lawyers at Play, Literature, Law, and Politics at the Early Modern Inns of Court, 1558 through 1581. I was able to get my copy through Amazon, but it sent me to a different bookseller site through Amazon. So don't be alarmed if that's what you need to do. And you're going to want to add this one to your collection, folks. I know most of you, and I know your libraries, and this one belongs in there. In order for us to truly understand what happened during the time of Shakespeare and Shakespeare's works being created, I think we need to look back on the history that led to that. And this is certainly a magnificent source to do that. Thank you again, Jessica, so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So that's a wrap for this episode, fellow Quillers. I thank you all for being here. I am so grateful to be a part of this wonderful Quiller Nation with all of you. And before we go, I want to remind you that I love to hear from you all. So send me your comments, requests, and yes, your complaints to contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com, contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. I will respond either directly or right here on the program. And now it's time again to throw the show to our very own producer, Jake, to announce this month's Quiller of the Month. Take it away, Jake.
Thank you, Stephen, and hello to all the Quillers out there. You know the deal by now. You know what it is. I do. It is my honor once again to spin the wheel and select our Quiller of the Month for the month of July 2025. If you would like your name thrown into the pot and get a chance of your very own at becoming the Quiller of the Month, have your name and lights go down in the annals of history, and get an item of your choosing from the shop. You can only do so by becoming a patron over at patreon.com/don'tquillthemessenger. Without further ado, the Quiller of the Month for the month of July is Deduce. Deduce. Simply deduce. 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 To arrive at a conclusion, we have arrived at our Quiller of the Month. Congrats, Deduce. Keep your eye on your email. Thanks to each and every one of you for continued support of the program. Back to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Jake. And as always, congratulations to our winner. And a hearty thank you to all of you who helped make this show happen by contributing how and what you can through our Patreon page. Until next time, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.